Hey, everybody, welcome to Here's the Scoop from NBC News. I'm Yasmin Vasugian. It has been a landmark day at the Supreme Court. The justices struck down most of President Trump's tariffs, a centerpiece of his economic agenda, ruling that he exceeded his authority by using a law reserved for a national emergency. It's a rare loss for President Trump at the Supreme Court, but at a press conference today, he said it was not going to set him back. We're going to break down the decision, the fallout from Wall Street to Main Street, and what cards the president may have left to play. First, I want to bring in NBC News senior Supreme Court reporter Lawrence Hurley and senior business correspondent Christine Romans. Hey, guys. Whoa, what a day. Give me your reactions, your gut reactions. Lawrence, you first.
Well, from my perspective as a Supreme Court reporter, this was the first significant ruling in which the court has really pushed back on President Trump since he took office again last year, something that some people were questioning last year when the court was frequently ruling in his favor on a lot of emergency cases.
Christine?
Look, the president has said he wanted to remake the global economy. He didn't want to use Congress to do that. Only he knew how to do it. And this is the first time that he has been told no. The Supreme Court ruling that he illegally collected $133 billion from American businesses and importers, and that he does not have the power to do that. So it is a very significant moment in what is his signature economic policy.
So let's break down the decision and that $133 billion. Lawrence, to you first. Talk about this decision, 6-3. Walk us through it.
Yeah, so the way this broke down was the court's conservative majority, 6 justices, were divided. So there were 3 in the majority, 3 in dissent, plus the 3 liberal justices in the majority, 2, all agreeing with the 3 other conservatives that President Trump could not do these tariffs under this law called IEEPA, which allows for some emergency measures to be taken regarding the economy. But the law doesn't actually mention tariffs. And the court said, under this statute, you just can't do tariffs. You can't do it. That doesn't mean President Trump can't do any tariffs, because there are other laws that do allow him to do this. They're a little more onerous and require a bit more homework. They don't allow President Trump to immediately announce he's going to do them and then they'll immediately go into effect the way that he's done with these IEEPA tariffs. So it imposes new restrictions on President Trump's power in a way that hasn't happened yet since he's taken office again. The fact that 3 of the conservative justices dissented is also pretty interesting because there's this theory that they adopted during the Biden presidency when they ruled against Biden on various big issues, including his student loan debt relief plan, saying that the president can't do things unless Congress has authorized them. And some of the justices didn't seem to think that applies to President Trump, at least in this case.
Christine, there's a point in which we understand that this affects most but not all tariffs, right? And Lawrence talked a little bit about that. But what tariffs is this actually affecting?
Okay, so if you remember in April, the president stood in the Rose Garden. He had this big placard made with the names of all these countries and a number, a big number, 67%, 87%, 27%. These were his reciprocal tariffs. These were the country-specific tariffs that he put on for a national emergency. And the national emergency, he said, was drugs and it was trade deficits. Well, now the Supreme Court has ruled he doesn't have that power to just impose those tariffs in that way. Remember, those tariffs were the basis for a bunch of different trade negotiations even. And the president elicited a bunch of commitments from countries to invest in the United States. I mean, all of that now, that authority has been thrown out. Now, what the president is promising to do is use other authorities he has. And Lawrence is right that those are a little more onerous, a little more difficult. He has teased in this press conference today that he's going to put an immediate 10% tariff on everyone and start from there. He does have that authority, but only for 150 days. After that, I mean, the statute's very clear. I mean, Congress has to be on board and help him renew those. So he doesn't have sort of what critics and what the plaintiffs had said was this king-like ability to just pick and choose and put these tariffs on. He's lost that authority.
I want to talk about the $133 billion gained because of these tariffs here in the United States. In his speech today, the president said that tariffs were important for economic national security. He touted the Dow had passed 50,000 and the S&P is above 7,000. We just got those new GDP numbers in as well today, saying U.S. economic growth slowed at the end of 2025. You had Justice Kavanaugh in his dissenting opinion saying refunds of billions of dollars would have, quote, significant consequences for the U.S. Treasury. How do you unravel $133 billion, Christine?
Yeah, and the Supreme Court did not give a playbook for that. But it is clear that money was illegally collected from American companies and in many cases passed on to American consumers. Those are illegally collected billions of dollars. So what the government could do, and it has the ability to do this. These tariffs are directly deducted from the customs of all of this is electronically done. They could just refund those with or without interest, whatever. The president today said, calling the plaintiffs, who are small business owners, sleazebags, I think, he said that they're going to have to fight him in court. It could take up to 5 years. Some companies like Costco and others have already sued in front of a trade court in the United States saying we want a refund, that the president illegally used this authority. It's interesting to me, too, because it's a White House that's trying to stay on message about affordability. But you have the president saying he doesn't want to give these small and mid-sized businesses any money back, and he will find new ways to put on these tariffs.
Well, and you could have consumers sitting at home saying, wait, does that mean that he doesn't care about whether or not I'm getting that money back in my pocketbook because I paid more for that couch than I should have because of these illegal tariffs? I mean, is there a possibility in the future? I know it's all going to be tied up in the court system for some time, Christine, but is there a possibility that American consumers could see some of that money?
It's unclear. And, remember, the president had said he was going to use this tariff money. He has teased he was going to give a $2,000 check to people. Just now he said he gave $12 billion in tariff money to farmers last week. Let's remember that farmers were retaliated against by countries who were angry about these reciprocal tariffs that have now been proven to be illegal. It's a big mess, unclear how it all unravels.
Lawrence, what does this decision mean for how the court is making decisions when it comes to the Trump administration this year in the president's second year in office?
Yeah, I think it's really significant because we heard a lot last year about how the court was ruling in favor of Trump quite frequently on these kind of emergency applications that were getting filed with great frequency over all kinds of policies on whether they could go into effect or not while litigation continued. But those weren't final rulings on the merits of those policies, whereas this one is. And it's quite significant because obviously the Trump has lost this case, right? So even though he won all these other cases last year, as soon as the court hears full arguments and thinks about it for a while and issues a big written decision like we have got today, they found against the president. And there's going to be more cases coming up like this as we go further into the presidency, and perhaps Trump continues to lose popularity and the court feels like it has more freedom to perhaps rule against him because it's always aware of public opinion. So we may see more of this, especially in the case coming up on Trump's attempt to end birthright citizenship.
Lawrence Hurley, Christine Romans, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
So tariffs were key to President Trump's economic agenda, meant to rebalance the trade deficit and bring manufacturing jobs back here to the United States. Now that the Supreme Court has actually struck down most of these tariffs, the question is, what does this mean for the president's economic agenda going forward? For that, I want to bring in White House correspondent Monica Alba. Hey, Monica.
Hello.
Okay, so take us through it. In a press conference this afternoon, the president slammed the ruling, said he was, quote unquote, ashamed of the justices that voted against his tariffs. Talk about how he first learned about the Supreme Court decision and what else he said in that press conference this afternoon.
So earlier this morning, the president was meeting with a bipartisan group of governors in the state dining room. It was a breakfast. And as we know, those Supreme Court decisions come down right around that 10 a.m. Eastern marker. And we all said to ourselves, ooh, this, if it's tariffs, is going to happen while he's speaking. So when the world learned about it, the president actually was one of the last people to know because he was in that room. And it was an aide who passed him a note eventually quickly informing him of what had happened. And he immediately reacted to it in real time in front of these governors, saying, according to a person familiar with his reaction, that the ruling was a disgrace. He told the people assembled there that he did have a backup plan, and then he actually left earlier than he had planned to stay at this event, he said, to go and deal with how they were going to react to this. And we found out that that was in the form of this press briefing. This is something that for him is personal. This is a cornerstone of his complete agenda, his policy. This is a hallmark. This is what he ran on, and this is what he often points to as being what he's most proud of, now majorly dismantled.
Monica, in the press conference today, the president announced a new global 10% tariff. And he also said that there could be other quote unquote alternatives. And he listed a bunch of other acts. Walk us through what the president believes these alternatives could be in continuing to impose his tariffs.
This is a president who basically is always looking for more ways to implement more tariffs. And what he is saying he might do now, or what he is directing his top officials to do, is essentially to carry out tariffs under a bigger national security umbrella. But the rate of these tariffs appears to be much lower than what it would have been under the far larger tariffs that he announced on Liberation Day, so-called Liberation Day, last April. So, of course, that's a major change. But that is the argument that the Treasury Secretary was making as well. And they are trying to position this as we will find a way to potentially, in the words of the president, potentially, quote, take in more money, he said. He argued that there will be some way to have what they would call a tariff revenue stream that they think is going to be just as large in 2026 as it was in 2025. But we really just don't know actually exactly how they plan to do that. And the president's been talking about using licensing fees or using potential other avenues if this were to come down. But again, we haven't actually seen the specifics on how this would work.
I want to be clear here because the tariffs, Monica, that have been imposed so far have cost U.S. businesses and American consumers a lot of money. You have now small business groups that are calling for refunds. You have Senators Elizabeth Warren getting on board with that, California Governor Gavin Newsom as well. Is he addressing this at all, or from your sources that you're speaking to inside the White House, is this a concern of theirs as they look ahead to reimburse the American consumer?
And who knows how that's actually going to work? I mean, that was a big question in the opinion, because to say that would be messy is to put it really, really lightly. Again, it's not really clear how that might work. And the White House, I think, politically views this as a definite sensitivity that ultimately, when you talk to all voters, overwhelmingly their number one concern is the economy, right? And that is always factored into a couple of different buckets. When we're talking about the economy, for some people that is, just daily cost of living and high prices and expenses. And for others, you mentioned small businesses, certainly it is the larger economic policy of the Trump administration, which we should point out, it was our own colleague Tom Yamas who asked the president recently, are we in the Trump economy now? Are you owning this current economy? And the president said, yes, this is my Trump economy. Because remember that before tariffs, the argument was, well, this is still the leftover Biden economy. You need to wait and you need to see the benefits and it's going to take some time. He has now owned this and now he owns the real repercussions and fallout now of this. And I do think people definitely have looked to the president. Some of his biggest fans, some of his biggest supporters have said, well, we don't really understand some of why he's doing this on tariffs, but we're sure in the end it's going to work out. And then you have a decision like this today, and you're going to probably start to see more concerns about why the president went down this road only to now end back up in this position.
I got to also say, what about, Republican members of Congress? Because we've got a growing list of reaction from Democratic members of Congress, both in the House and the Senate. We don't have that list yet for Republican members of the House and or the Senate. They're going to have an uphill battle with this thing as well, having supported the president on tariffs through it all.
What's so interesting, though, is that you have seen some Republicans speak out against tariffs because that's what they were hearing in their districts. That's what they were hearing from members, that this was hurting their bottom line or was hurting their small businesses. And our colleague Ryan Nobles really positioned a great line of questioning to the president, which was, why not work with Congress to then potentially pursue a path where you could have these tariffs set up, again, through Congress, through law, and establish that. And the president really said he didn't have an appetite for that and that he wasn't going to do that. But as Ryan smartly pointed out in the moment, too, that's also because there isn't enough of an appetite in Congress to necessarily pass that. And you saw Congress a couple of months ago rebuke specific tariffs that the Trump administration had announced on a couple of select countries. And so you have seen them at times, some Republicans and Democrats overwhelmingly, speak out against this policy and raise questions about what it meant ultimately for American consumers.
I was just speaking with Lawrence Hurley about Justice Gorsuch's concurring opinion about the separation of powers. The conservative justices of the Supreme Court have had an expansive view of presidential power under Trump. I would, look especially to the immunity decision out of the Supreme Court. But Gorsuch, in his opinion, essentially said, and I'm paraphrasing here, there are limits to presidential power, and this, in fact, is the limit. How is this going to impact not just the president's agenda, but how he acts on his agenda?
Well, it was interesting. The president was asked, what does this mean for the justices who basically voted against your policy in terms of the State of the Union, which is coming up in just a couple of days? Typically, you would see the Supreme Court justices, not always all of them, but a majority of them sitting there among the first few rows. And he was asked if that means that those who basically disagreed with him are not invited anymore. And he said, well, they're still invited, but barely. They're barely invited, which was a moment. And it really is going to be striking. I mean, for a president who is obsessed with the optics and the images, and we should mention that today in the press conference, they had special lighting for the president that the White House adjusted before he came out there that we have never seen before in the press briefing room. There was sort of more of a blue lighting behind him. It almost had a little bit of a cinematic effect. And we certainly, all of us, who've worked and covered this White House for a while and previous administrations, we've never seen anything like that. But I think the State of the Union is sort of another incredible opportunity a couple of days from now to see the optics of this, to see some of these Supreme Court justices potentially who just issued this landmark ruling sit before him, and to likely watch the president, who has never been one to shy away from expressing his real feelings about them and about this overall, potentially do that in a major primetime address like the State of the Union is going to be really something to watch for.
Quite a day. Always on a Friday,
Yes,
though. Always on a Friday.
No such
Monica
thing
Alba.
as a slow news day ever.
Not now.
No.
Not never, it seems. Monica Alba, thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right, that is going to do it for us at Here's the Scoop from NBC News. I'm Yasmin Vasugian. We'll have a special episode out tomorrow with Olympic gold medalist Michaela Schifrin, and then a full episode on Monday with whatever the weekend may bring. And if you like what you heard and you watched, hit that subscribe button. We'll see you tomorrow.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.